puberty blockers became available as sort of standardised practice at these younger ages from 2014. Although some of the clinicians didn't understand perhaps why you might refer, even after 6 sessions, which was the kind of the assessment model, they weren't overly concerned, because in their eyes at that time, what they were constantly being told, and there was nothing to suggest to the contrary, was that what the puberty blockers did was they provided time to think, and there were no long-term effects, and they were completely reversible. And actually, what so many of those young people needed was time to think. They were very, very distressed. And the rationale of the blocker makes perfect sense. That you've got this mismatch between your biological sex and the gender identity that you perceive. You stop your body going through the puberty of your biological sex, and then you can hopefully take away some of that distress and then think about things. Now, it was only really when, so in those years, 2015-ish, lots of clinicians told me that pretty much any young person that wanted the blocker could have it during quite a quick assessment. And actually, as long as they met the criteria for gender dysphoria, which pretty much all of them did because they're silly and most teenagers would meet them, they would be referred for puberty blockers.
What were the criteria for gender dysphoria that you say were silly?
Well, one area, this is a rare moment of agreement from both those who are very pro-medical intervention and those who are very against, is that they're steeped in gender stereotypes. So it'd be things like playing with toys that are typically associated with the opposite sex, having friends that are mostly of the opposite sex, wanting to be the opposite. They're just...
So if I were a girl who was a bit of a tomboy,
yeah,
quote unquote, and I felt some sort of distress, puberty blockers, off you go.
Well, you have to have the distress, and it has to be for more than 6 months. But 6 months is not a huge amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
No.
It's not a huge amount of time. And actually, the small amount of data that we do have kind of bears out that in those years, sort of 2014, 15, 16, lots of people, well, proportionally, lots of people were referred. Like this data that I mentioned before that they didn't release because apparently no one has it, but there's a graph, it's the only graph in the book, and it actually shows that, of those who were referred in adolescence, the majority went on to be referred for puberty blockers. And the peak is at about 14. And I turned into an absolute uber geek, and I actually blew this thing up, and I'm measuring it, and I'm like, 1 millimetre is this. And so I do actually get their numbers, and it's about 70% of 14-year-olds during this particular time period. And now you get an average of a minority, 40%, because the really young ones obviously aren't eligible to be referred. And so it's the classic, the average, the mean is meaningless because it hides what's going on in the middle.
So, that being the case, when was the moment that the medical community started to go, there's something very wrong going on here?
It was really when the first bit of data came back from this study that had begun, which challenged all the assumptions they had about puberty blockers. Because what this showed was that of those who had become old enough by that point, every single one of them had gone from the puberty blocker to cross-sex hormones. But also that there'd been no psychological benefit to being on the puberty blocker. And so for Dr. Anna Hutchinson, she describes learning that as her holy fuck moment because it exploded everything that they were doing. She said, what are the chances of being given time to think and all children and young people thinking the same way? She's like, that just doesn't happen. It doesn't happen in psychology. And also, even if we gave them time to, that this is what they did do, there was no space to think in the Tavistock model anyway, in the JIDS model. Because when you went on the blocker, you didn't have more talking, you had less. you got seen every 3 to 6 months. And so, and actually, these young people weren't feeling better. In some cases, both psychologically and physically, they were getting worse. And so at that point, quite a sizable number of clinicians just went, this isn't safe, what we're doing.